I am live with Brewster, who is the CPO of DemandBase, and we're going to talk a little bit about the path to Chief Product Officer. Welcome to the show, Brewster.
Thank you for having me, Tom. Good to be here.
Yeah. Well, it's exciting to talk to folks who have had such a kind of illustrious career. Why don't you give us a little bit of a background on how you ended up where you are? Where did the story begin?
Well, that's very kind of you. I have a non-traditional product background. I started my career working on Wall Street, working in finance, and I recklessly quit my job to found a startup. So I think I did what all great product people do is
Mm-hmm.
learn by building. So I was a very product-centric CEO, and was fortunate enough in that startup to be able to be acquired. And at the acquiring company, I became the head of product. And that was sort of my first ever product role in terms of pure product, which I think is unusual in that you don't usually start as a leader of product. You start as a PM, but that was just sort of my journey. So I led product for a company called Simply Measured, went on to be acquired by Sprout Social, and then I went over to another company called Visible, and I led product there again in the sort of marketing attribution space. Visible got acquired by Marketo, went on in a product leadership role there. Adobe acquired Marketo from there. So I sort of had this Russian nested dolls of acquisitions. We went from kind of growth stage startup to sort of big PE back to sort of huge public company. And then I left Adobe to go over to Google, and I know you're there these days, and I think obviously an amazing place to be. And then recently, about a year ago, made the jump from Google over to DemandBase to be Chief Product Officer. And I think the transition from product leader to CPO, it reminds me of a lot of being a founder again. Because you feel the weight of every decision you make in, I think, a different way when you're sort of just have the whole of the company, right? Versus kind of a smaller part of the portfolio. So for me, as a CPO, right, you're kind of responsible when things go wrong, like the buck stops with you. There's kind of nowhere else to point. But I think I find so much value and find it so deeply rewarding to sort of get the level of customer interaction I do. I know I've always believed that good product management is really a function of customer empathy and deeply understanding one's customers. And I think, in the role of CPO, I get to spend more time with customers than maybe I ever have as a product leader. And to me, like, that's what's inspiring, because ultimately that's what we're doing, is we're trying to solve the most impactful problems for our customers and do it in the most elegant way that we can. And so it's really been a great run for me, and I sort of fell into product, but have loved every piece of that journey.
Yeah, definitely an exciting kind of path that you've been on, and such a variety of environments. What do you think are some of the unique capabilities that a CPO needs that a garden variety product management leader or maybe senior manager may not have, that they will need to develop to really thrive as a CPO?
Yeah, I think, a big part of being a CPO is being able to sell. I think, we kind of bring me in on deals in ways that I probably haven't been as just a product leader, where it's really kind of getting close to every kind of open deal. And for me in the B2B SaaS, maybe a little bit different. And if you're a consumer CPO, but as a B2B SaaS CPO, that's sort of the piece that I'm kind of do more of than I ever have, is, you're really, really focused on how do you drive the key metrics of the business. I think the other thing that you do as a CPO that you probably don't do as a product leader is spend a lot of time with the board, right? And I think you get good product strategy always looks further into the future, but at kind of the C level, here comes my dog, hello. You really get the chance to go deeper in some ways on that product strategy, to really be able to think kind of 5 years out and really tie it exactly to where the company is going, and kind of be a part of those discussions and help set that tone with everything that you do.
And what do you think about the connective tissue between you talking to the board about long term, or talking to customers about where the product is going and the vision, with the folks on the product team that are in the trenches doing the work and making kind of near term calls? Like, how do you make that connection, maintain that connection?
I love that you use the term connective tissue, because that's typically how I describe product management, is really being the connective tissue of an organization. So I'm right there. I think for the team, it's really about helping them understand the path to where we're trying to go. So I'm someone who always like to think about what's the outcome we want to accomplish. I think you probably are well indoctrinated in launches and landings, and that's
Mm.
something, the landing that's always really stuck with me, so to speak, is where is it that we need to be 5 years from now? What does success look like? If we're going to realize our vision, what will the world look like? Right. And I think it's about charting a path backwards and exactly how to get there. When I think about working with kind of individual PMs who might be on a much kind of smaller scope, smaller part of the portfolio, it's really being able to tie a direct line between the product that they're working on and that broader vision 5 years out,
Mhm.
and being able to really clearly show how, this is what we need to develop here. This is what we need to grow here. This is where we need to enable this particular customer use case or engage this particular customer persona in ways that we haven't before, because this is where we need to go. And so I think the more that you can tie to that future, sort of the work that happens in the present. And I think this is true not just for product managers, but also for engineers, right? I think folks are inspired by knowing that they're getting to build something bigger, accomplish and solve a bigger problem. And so for me, it's always about how do you connect those two?
Yeah. And you talked about the importance of vision and starting where you want the world to look, and then working backwards. How do you build alignment within your others, so the rest of the C-suite and key eng leads and things who have different perspectives, and how do you find this way to converge things?
Yeah. Well, I think fundamentally our job as product leaders is to be really, really good funnels and to be able to distill a variety of disparate impacts, or disparate inputs, I should say. And so really looking around and saying, okay, what am I hearing from my CRO? What am I hearing from the chief customer officer? And oftentimes very different things. And I think
Hmm.
what tries to ground this is that, we really try and leverage a prioritization framework that says, okay, tell me why you want this, right? And we have all these various inputs. And so, when I go to an engineering leader or I go to a CRO and say, we're not prioritizing this, and there's a ultimate question is, well, why? This is so important. And of course, as we know, everything is so important. We have so much to do. That's fundamentally the
Hmm.
job, is to try and make these really hard trade-off decisions in a resource constrained world. But I think when we're able to show to, this is the framework, that this is what we're optimizing for, and understanding that these are what our OKRs are at a corporate level, and then how our product OKRs tie into that. And I think when you're able to kind of clearly demonstrate that, clearly explicate that to those stakeholders, they start to understand. I think when you don't share that visibility is when things get tough. If you're not kind of really transparent about the ways that you're making prioritization decisions and folks don't feel heard, they don't feel like an input into that, that's when you run into trouble. But we effectively are on perennial fireside chats. We're always trying to listen to kind of all of the stakeholders in the business, right? Whether that's finance, who's going to push on us to drive gross margin up, right? Or our customers are really thinking about, like, why don't you do this simple thing for us, instead of, how do you drive innovation for kind of
Hmm.
our hunters on the sales team? So we'd really try and kind of balance that and prioritize across those different factors. And we actually change the weights of those factors sort of based on what strategy looks like. Because, in a given year, we might actually be focusing more on retention than growth. And I think when that's the case, we'll change what actually our prioritization metric is, to be able to focus on that ultimate KPI.
Brewster, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about building a strong product organization, kind of looking inwards within the function. What's been your experience and learnings about how to build like a high performing product management function?
Yeah, well, I think the highest performing product management functions start with the best talent. So for me,
Mhm.
it's always about thinking about who are we hiring, who are we bringing in, and what do those folks look like. I think the first thing that I'm always looking for in the PMs on the team and within the product org is empathy. And so I'm both trying to recruit for empathy and try and build it within the team, because I think, that's really what we need to understand, is having that level of customer empathy is what drives really good solutions to products. So I think that's where I start. I think the other critical part in building a product org is really building a group of folks who are really comfortable with ambiguity. And I think that's, maybe particularly true at more of a startup or a scale up phase, when you really, hopefully a product market fit, but even beyond that, right? So many different opportunities and even kind of greater resource constraints than experienced at a place like Google, for example. And so you really need to find folks who understand what to do with that ambiguity and can drive clarity from it. And then I think really driving close collaboration and close relationships across the organization. I think that starts with engineering. I don't think you can have a strong product org if you're not deeply aligned with engineering. I think about those as kind of two sides of the same coin, in that, product really can't get anything done without engineering, and sort of vice versa, but actually Eng can get something done without product. So we're not quite as on the same level, but I mean, that's
Yeah.
how I think about it is, and that's our most critical stakeholder. But the same is true of, our sellers, of our design team. It's sort of, how do we drive this really, really close collaboration and also really strong communication, right? And I think as product leaders and as a product org, we really have to understand how to communicate cross-functionally, and we kind of speaking a different language, when we're, prepping for a sprint with engineers versus when we're talking to the product marketing org about a launch. And I think it's really, really important that we understand how to traverse those various components, because that's what a good product org does. Like, getting back to the connective tissue piece, is I really think about having the product org both kind of setting the strategy, evangelizing the vision, and then ultimately driving execution, right? In so many ways, product leadership is about, leading without managing, and leading through influence. And I think that's what I try and build within the folks on my team, is really helping them to drive change, to drive action, and ultimately drive outcomes across the org.
Those are a wide range of crucial capabilities and kind of competencies that PMs need. How do you ascertain that in the recruiting process? How do you figure out if this candidate is going to be successful in your org?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of product sense style interview, product design style interviewing versus the kind of behavioral interview. I
Hmm.
find that when you sort of ask people, like, tell me about a time when you dealt with ambiguity, you don't learn as much as actually giving them a really ambiguous problem. So, when we interview, we definitely deploy that kind of style to work them through solving a real life problem or having a real life strategy question. And when we find that, can actually see how folks think, I think you learn a lot more by problem solving side by side with someone. So when we go through that interview process, we're really trying to coach everyone to work with the candidate and see how the candidate thinks, see how the candidate considers risks, see how the candidate looks at trade-offs, and ultimately, how does the candidate prioritize? And so we spend a lot of time actually working through those exercises to get as close to, like, what would their real product development process look like? How would they actually go about building something if you kind of gave them this scope, if you gave them this area of the portfolio? What would they do? And I find that that's kind of the most helpful way to really learn about someone and how they think as a product manager.
Got it. And once you get them in the door, what are your kind of best practices on onboarding new talent? Like, do you all take a position of, like, learn by doing, or is there more of a training kind of process? How does that work?
So I'm definitely a big fan of learn by doing, of learn by shipping, right?
Yeah.
I would say, like, we should do a better job of onboarding folks with content. I would think that's probably on my 2023 OKRs, where today we're still at that phase of a company where you kind of get thrown a little bit and you got to just kind of go figure it out. But I think it really helps to enable and to really understand kind of the breadth of the portfolio, really getting kind of to learn every piece of the stack. And you can do that, of course, by building across different things, shipping different features. But I also think it's really important to, like, get into the documentation, to get certified on the product, to get trained in the same way that kind of every solutions architect might be, right? I think you want product managers who deeply, deeply understand the product and the rest of the portfolio, even if it's not what they're managing themselves, because ultimately, trying to find is what's synergistic across the portfolio, and having that knowledge of sort of where you can find natural tie-ins. And for us, we have a very broad product portfolio across a number of different commercial clouds. So we're always thinking from a cross-sell, upsell perspective is, how do we drive more value from the sum of the parts? So I think when we think about onboarding, it's about trying to get knowledge, and then folks trying to get them shipping as fast as they can, right? I think the sooner that you can kind of write a PRD, and even for something small, and then trying to ship that, the sooner you're sort of starting to be productive. And I think that's hard for PMs, because it takes time, right? To really learn both the team that you're working with and the products that you're working on. But I think the more that you can kind of do it, the better.
And then once they get their sea legs and they're getting stuff out there, what's your approach on how to develop talent? A lot of PMs are often high achievers, very kind of, goal oriented, and they want to grow, as we all do. How do you support that?
Yeah, well, I mean, fortunate, I think in a scale up type of environment, there's the opportunity to always kind of give incremental scope. So for me, it's always kind of giving folks more than they might feel comfortable with. I think
Mm,
that's a place to really find growth, is you kind of say, look, I know you're managing X. Do you want to take on Y? And of course, you don't voice that on folks, but given that I think product managers typically are kind of hungry and driven and
mhm,
ambitious, it's generally they want more scope, right? And it's whether that's scope creep in building an individual product or kind of what they really want to do in their career. So I'm always trying to find kind of stretch opportunities, right? When we see something new that opens up with a partner, for example, finding a PM who says, I want to go take that on. And, I've never worked with that kind of, integration type stack, but that's a new opportunity. So for us and for my leadership team, I think we're always thinking about how can we map our opportunities, the places where we haven't gone yet, where we haven't invested, and finding that and connecting that to kind of the individual contributors on the team. And then I think, sharing of best practices. I think I find myself learning all the time from the folks on my team. And so we'd really trying to facilitate that kind of cross pollination of ideas where folks can understand, why is someone approaching it this way? Why are they building X? What do they see in the market? And so we have a lot of kind of share outs of that nature to be able to learn from one another. And I think that, in addition to seeing that from your peers is actually a really great way to grow. And so try and drive that collaboration and that kind of teamwork across all kinds of new growth areas.
how do you know when someone's ready for that additional scope? A lot of PMs always want it. How do you
Yeah.
decide if they're ready for it?
Well, I think it's really tying to what outcome have they driven thus far. So, I mean, I'm always
Mm,
thinking about it also tied to that growth is figuring out for you as PM, like this is what you need to accomplish, right? Whether that's this
mhm.
particular North Star metric, if you can move it X% and you've figured out how to do that, for me, that's typically a pretty good sign that, if we kind of have something a little bit orthogonal to that, that you can be able to push on that too, that you're going to be able to move on that too. So what I'm really looking for is, have we kind of set a course with an outcome that you were trying to achieve? And then were you able to achieve it? And then I think the more that you build those proof points of where you were able to realize something that otherwise might have been impossible, and driven towards that business outcome. When I see that, that's when I say let's take on more. And I think that's also how we think about kind of promotions as folks kind of grow in the org that way, is always very much tied towards what are the milestone outcomes that we're trying to accomplish, right? Not just sort of what did we ship, but how did we actually change the business? And I'm very much a fan of the model of PMs as CEOs, whether that's kind of, and maybe that comes from being an entrepreneur, but whether that's kind of CEO of a feature for someone junior, CEO of a product, or CEO of a whole portfolio, is kind of letting them run that way and driving with that kind of autonomy. And when you give, I think the best PMs autonomy is like they thrive in those environments, right? They're not just kind of looking for it. They really, really do their best work when they have the ability to kind of to drive in that way. So that's always what I'm trying to enable.
I'm sure when you were earlier in your career as a PM, you found it from time to time frustrating to get sort of reviews and approvals at various levels, maybe above you. Now you're the CPO. You're often where the buck stops for some of the biggest product decisions. How do you find a way to balance the desire to empower these PMs that your org has assigned versus like you're also on the hook for the success of the company overall in terms of its product
Yeah, I
strategy?
mean, I think, and so much about that is just, trust in the team. I mean, I really think in my job in so many ways is about enabling. It's, giving my team tools they need to do their best work and then getting out of their way. And so, what does that mean? That means, giving them the strategy, having them a clear line of sight to what the vision is, giving them resources, whether that's engineering or otherwise. And so I think for me, it's really giving them that autonomy and then taking a step back. And I find that when you do that, folks will actually come to you and they'll say, this is a critical decision. I think when you're kind of leaning over them and kind of looking to see is, what are you really doing here? It ultimately makes it more difficult to actually surface those kind of decisions. Cause I think folks actually find that tough to interact with. And so for me, I'm always kind of saying, let's bias towards that level of autonomy and know that kind of, when something comes up that's a decision across the portfolio, right? How do we actually prioritize when maybe we have some fungible resources across 3 different product areas? That's when I expect the team to come to me. And that's where I'm sort of focused on, okay, how can I make the meta prioritization decision here? And again, kind of sticking with the same framework, just on a higher level. So I'm always sort of encouraging the team, go on your own, not in a we'll send you off into the wilderness kind of way, but rather, we trust in you to be able to make the right calls. And then, where you feel stuck, where you feel like there are issues, please come to me and I try and unblock it.
And do you feel like that approach um, is the same, irrespective of the stage of the company or the product development, or do you think,
I do.
like as a head of product, you may lean in more or less depending on where the company is?
Yeah, I definitely think it changes based on stage. I think it like if I think about when I've been at earlier stage, I probably wasn't quite so laissez-faire, if you will,
Hmm.
where you're kind of thinking like we don't have product market fit yet. I think in those very early days, and of course those are much smaller teams, so you're even more hands-on. So I think in those worlds, you kind of really get close to every decision because the leverage on them is so great, right? I think as you scale, you have a little bit more leniency with sort of potentially making the wrong decision. And something I really try and encourage is it being okay to make mistakes, it being okay to find failures through really fast experimentation. I think as long as you learn from that, but in the earlier stages, I definitely find myself rolling up my sleeves a little bit more than I would otherwise and really trying to engage on every one of those decisions. I think, at the scale that we're at DemandBase, it simply wouldn't work for me to do that, right? It's too much kind of depth of the portfolio to be able to get in there. And I think, think about later stage, right? Of course, never been the CPO of something the size of Adobe or Google, but even at those as a leader there, yeah, I think you reach out to empower folks in ways that, you really need to because they have that smaller scope relative to the entirety of the enterprise.
What do you think is the hardest part of the CPO job?
Well, I think it's similar to any product. When things go wrong, they're your fault, right? And I think it's my job to be accountable, right? I think if we release a bug, right, and it's not because the requirements were bad, something might have happened in a release, and it's my job to go take accountability for that with the customer, right? And I think when things go well, it's not my job to take credit. It's my job to share that credit, to give that credit, to highlight all of the great work that everyone else does. So I think that really takes an appropriate mindset to be able to work through that, to really think about, no matter what happens, I'm going to step in front of the proverbial bus and do whatever it takes to make my team successful. And then I'm going to celebrate everything that they do alongside that success and really be their kind of biggest supporter. So for me, the challenge is not knowing. You don't know how it's going to turn out in so many ways. And I think you really want to focus on, what can I do to make the best possible outcome? How can I enable my team to have the best possible outcome? And then, when things go wrong, ensure that you're accountable.
Let's nerd out a little bit around some sort of deep product management practices around organizational design. So I actually a lot of people who will listen to this will be kind of in the annual planning phase,
Mhm.
and they're looking at org structure, org charts, swim lanes, that kind of thing. And I feel like there's always this debate around like, oh, do you have a PM focused on a customer problem? Do you have them focus on a section of the product, or are they more horizontal? How do you set up this org for success, knowing that there are horizontal things, but then there are vertical things, and Eng and UX, they have their own design. What's been your kind of best practices on how to come up with that org chart that works for everybody and helps the company succeed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely varies based on kind of what the portfolio looks like and the scale of the company and kind of
Hmm.
what you're trying to build. I think for us, I mean, we try and very much closely align to how we go to market. So we've got kind of four broad clouds that we kind of sell different product lines, which also happen to be kind of very closely aligned to personas. For me, I prefer sort of a persona based development and having kind of a product leader aligned to that persona. And we, in many ways, kind of have the persona across a sales leader. We have persona across a marketing or demand gen leader. We have a
Hmm.
paid media persona, and then we have a data persona, and that sort of aligns to our sort of four commercial lines of business, and sort of really treat the product leaders for that folks, as GMs, where they're really thinking about how do we best serve this persona, and how do we deliver for them, whatever the value that they're trying to get, and also how do we do as a business, and how do we monetize across that. And then I like a model that has that sort of persona alignment vertically, but then also finds ways to actually collaborate horizontally. So kind of under those vertical teams, we actually put together horizontal platform teams, one around data, right? I think because you kind of think about
Hmm.
you need to have this data powering across all of these different business lines, all the different products that are ultimately kind of powered through the same data platform. And then, we think about, we've got a team for core and shared services, right? So we don't need to kind of rebuild the same login across different applications serving different personas. The things that aren't unique to the persona that you're serving vertically, I think you really want to find ways to efficiently build and to share resources, to have shared components. And so we kind of think about all of our horizontal teams as really serving those vertical teams, as really those are their customers, right? With the same level of customer commitment to actually do customer discovery, right? Which is, I think, an interesting that I try and push on our horizontal teams, is to really go spend time with the vertical teams and to understand and to learn, what are the problems that they're facing, what are they ultimately trying to solve for the end customer, and then what can we build to enable that.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Related question around org design and staffing. I often talk to a lot of people who are in related job functions, but not in product management, and they want to come into product management. And I'm curious what your approach to looking at kind of non-traditional PM candidates is. Have you found success with it, and any best practices around that?
Yeah, well, my first piece of advice always to would-be PMs is careful what you wish for. I think it's always, we think it's like it looks more glamorous than it really is. So I always try to give them fair warning on that. But yeah, I've definitely had success there before. I mean, I think some of the best functions to recruit from PM, I think I see really two profiles. I think one, you get kind of really great engineers can be really, really good PMs. Obviously, kind of understand the how, right by the what and the why.
Mm-hmm.
But then I've also had really good success kind of working with folks like sales engineers and
Mm-hmm.
support folks who have been so close to the customer problem. I think when you talk to folks who have been working in support and they hear that problem over and they know how to empathize, they've heard it, they get it, they care, right? And they also have really typically like good in-depth technical knowledge of the product. So I find that those kind of, support folks, maybe a little bit of success, maybe a little of sales engineering tend to be really, really strong. Obviously a different kind of profile than the engineer you bring in, but those are the sort of two buckets that I typically pick from. I can't say I've ever kind of recruited from like HR or legal, or I mean, it's actually interesting, when you're serving, because, we build products for sales and marketers, right? And so of
Mm-hmm.
course, also when folks really deeply understand the problem because they're experiencing it every day, they can oftentimes be strong in that vertical as well. So I think we try and lean on our subject matter experts who are kind of the personas that we serve with the products that we sell. We're lucky enough to have a great group of those internally that we often turn to them to help understand the problems that they're facing.
Yeah, no, it makes some sense, and I totally agree. Especially the converts from like product specialists, or folks that work with customers a lot. They often are a great feeder system as future PMs.
And a great source of insight, right? I think
Yeah.
that folks are on the front lines every day because like that's where I'm
Mm-hmm.
always trying to push our product team. I push us to do support rotations, right? Because it helps build that empathy and helps us see things that we might not otherwise when we're saying
Yeah.
this is good to ship, and then you actually get in there and you're like, oh, this is the problem that customer is facing. I get it now.
Yeah, totally, totally. What's the profile in terms for folks who are earlier in their career? Um, what's the typical background in terms of educational experience? How important is that? There was a time where a lot of companies were like, "Hey, you have to have a CS degree from a certain number of institutions," and it seems like there's been more opening up of the talent pool. What's your take on what educational background you like to see, or does it matter?
Yeah. Well, I think all things being equal, I'd prefer someone with an engineering background. But then at the same
Hmm.
time, I'm not someone with an engineering background. I studied philosophy, politics, economics, and communication. Like, that's not, does that set you up to do product management? I mean, I think what it set me up to do is have sort of a really good framework for critical thinking, to be able to
Hmm.
think cross-functionally and across disciplines. So for me, I try not to bias too much to any type of educational background. What I'm really looking for is, do you exhibit the skills that really strong product managers have? Are you a good problem solver? Are you a good communicator? Do you actually understand and empathize with the customer? But I will say, all things being equal, I want the person with the CS degree. That is true.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree with you as well. As a history and economics major, I clearly have seen how you don't need that to have impact. On the other hand, especially earlier in their career, if you're hiring like an entry level PM, if they can get into the technical details and build trust with the engineers early, that can be a big boost.
Yeah. And I think you've shipped too, right? When you're an engineer,
Hmm.
like when you have that, you know what it is to ship, and that, which is I think a new thing. And now, certainly you don't, as a philosophy student, wasn't shipping too much. I think you get used to actually getting things and building and getting stuff out the door. So folks who have done that, it really is an advantage.
And what's your take on when you're hiring, looking at people with startup experience versus like, established company experience versus giant tech experience? Do you have preferences, or how do you,
Yeah.
evaluate those different backgrounds?
It might be a bias. I think, I mean, from my own intrinsic bias to my own background, but I
Hmm.
really like folks who have kind of seen a variety of different stages, who have run the gamut. I think, it's really great for folks who have been at, really big major tech companies, who have been at the Googles of the world and kind of seen what best practices are like, sort of seen magic happen. But then I also want them to have, startup experience. If you put those two things together, right? Because I think in a startup, you're able to be gritty in ways, you
Hmm.
understand what it's like to not have everything you need, and to figure that out and to make it work. And so I think when you compare those things of, both knowing what truly excellent looks like, and then also kind of having the fortitude or the grit that comes from earlier stages, that's what I look for in a combo. Is, I think my ideal kind of 5-year PM candidate is someone who spent 2 or 3 years at a big company and then gone to a startup or a mid-stage company and seen what that's like, taken on greater scope. I think what is so powerful about earlier stage companies is you can develop so much in a shorter time, right? Because the company's growing faster, it's changing faster, you can pick up all this scope. And I think
Hmm.
in many ways you can get kind of 5 years of career development in just one. But if you've only been in that startup environment, right, like you may not know what amazing looks like, right? Just because
Hmm.
that's because you only have that sort of one sample size to go off of.
Yeah, yeah, definitely agree with you that having that variety. I mean, from personal experience, I think it makes you better. But again, you and I probably might have a little bias about like this is
Yeah,
what worked for me.
I'll acknowledge my bias on that one.
Do you many times the leader we are today is influenced by some key kind of formative experiences during our career, either big wins or often big kind of struggles. I'm curious, like, what made you the product leader you are today? What were there some things in your past where you're like, yeah, this year, what that year was a really hard thing, or that company or that role, or that was a huge win, and I learned these things.
Yeah, I think for me, the kind of the most critical shaping was kind of leaving a job in a totally different industry and starting and going to found something.
Mm.
At the time, I was young and dumb and thought that I knew everything. And I think it's totally okay not to know, but you have to know what you don't know. And I was someone who thought, of course, like how hard can it be to build software? How hard can it be to ship software? I mean, that can't be that hard, right? And I had a very, very humbling experience of learning, like, oh, wow, this is really, really hard, much harder than I anticipated. And I had to kind of be humbled in that way, and understand that, like, I just need to learn, right? So I spent a lot of time just, I started doing things like startup weekends and hackathons, and starting to build and actually understanding what it took. And then, through that process, sort of that, I think, first 2 years of, having my generative times building products is what shaped so much for me, because it kind of ingrained the mindset in my head that, look, you don't know. And I think the mindset of not knowing as a product leader is a very good one, because it means you're always going to go to the customer to try and learn. You're not focused on, I have this sort of incredible well of knowledge. I'm personally not a big fan of the cult of the visionary around product
Hmm.
leaders. I mean, of course, there's the Steve Jobs of the world. I'm not that, right? I think I'm someone who can really spend the time to learn, who can listen and talk to customers. And I think in order to be able to do that effectively, you have to be acknowledge that you don't know. And for me, like, acknowledging that I don't know, but I can learn, was probably the most important growth step in my life.
Yeah, totally. And what do you think in the in your career experience so far was a big win for you, and what were some like lessons you drew out of that that you still apply going forward?
Yeah. Well, I've some of the wins that I've been through. I've been through a lot of acquisitions.
Mhm.
So I've been acquired a lot. And now I'm hoping, knock on wood, I don't ever want to be acquired again. I'm really focused on building a really long-lasting independent company. But I mean, through that process, I think I learned a lot about how products are valued in the market and sort of what matters strategically. Now, if you work like, yeah, you don't build products to get acquired. You don't try to get acquired. I think if you do that, you'll fail. You build to solve for the customer. And so these things can kind of be distractions. I think if you're
Mhm.
chasing the acquisition, or you're kind of chasing, what does the strategic want, or what does the analyst want. And I think when you really, that taught me at least, through this, to just focus on solving the most impactful customer problem you can. And when you focus on that and you just go and do it, great things happen. I think, having that kind of reinforcement and reward mechanism taught me that, like, stay the course, do what you think is right, and do what's best by the customer.
Yeah, those are fundamentals that a lot of us sometimes forget from time to time, given all the important and urgent stuff that pops up during the day. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with someone that I was coaching, and they were saying, "Hey, I'm having a little bit of a challenge finding confidence in my roadmap," and we were kind of going into the whys of that. And one of the things that they acknowledged was they aren't spending as much time with customers as they would want to. And they say, "Yeah, I hear you. I know I should be getting out of the office and spending more time with customers at their elbow and really empathizing, but I'm busy with all of these other things that I got a million emails and my calendar's back to back, and there's all these things I'm blocking Eng teams on." What advice do you have for PMs to maintain that level of customer empathy and customer intelligence that does require a lot of time and a commitment?
Yeah. So for us, we actually have it as a product org OKR. So it's an
Mm,
OKR for every PM on the team to spend 20% of their time with customers, which is, that's a full day a week. It's a lofty
yeah.
goal. We haven't reached it yet, is the truth, but that's what we're trying to do. So
Mm,
I think, you manage to what you measure. And so by stating that this is an explicit goal, customer engagement, period, full stop. Right. I know that in itself isn't an outcome, but I think really driving and incentivizing that, where that's so critical, is that this is a key part of your job, is just talk to customers, right? Of course, we're trying to deliver outcomes, but I really think about telling every PM that this is something that you have to do to be successful. I think if you're not spending time with customers, you can't possibly build the right thing. And so that's what we grade folks on. Are you spending time with customers? Are you engaging with them? And I find that the more time that folks spend, typically the better their results are in the products that they ship and the problems that they solve for those folks.
and if we unpack time with customers, how do you what are the categories, or what are the most important ways you've seen that done? Is that jumping on to sales calls? Is it jumping on to like customer success calls? Is it visiting users, at their offices? Or what are the different types of customer interactions that you think are the
Yeah, it's
most
definitely a little bit of
valuable?
all of the above. I mean, way less chairside in the customer's office in the post-COVID world. I think
Yeah.
I definitely miss that. But I think, first, like, I mean, support really, really critical, right? Is, if you own a product, right, sitting in on support calls for your products and your feature and understanding sort of, what's not going right there.
Mm,
That's really critical. Of course, discovery, right? I think that applies a lot more to generative things, when you're really trying to go find a new space, or sort of find incremental value in the product you're already building. I think a lot of sort of roadmap and vision as well. So really trying to kind of evangelize and see how, kind of where you're going, if it doesn't resonate.
mm.
And then of course, sales is probably less, where you get less learning as a PM. But I also think it's really important, again, because I really think about holding PMs accountable to, the top line. Are we driving sales? So I think that kind of engagement as well is also really important. And I think one other one I'd call is not explicitly a customer, but spending time with partners, right? Which is this other really, really critical input. And I think about partners as sort of another, especially in a B2B SaaS environment, it's really another class of customer, another stakeholder that we really have to serve. So also thinking about that, because that gives signal in market that you may not get from the customer, understanding kind of where your key partners are going as well.
And how do you assess the impact of PMs spending direct time with customers versus more formal user experience research studies where the PM can observe or see the results and the readouts?
Yeah, I think both. Yes, and would be my answer to
Mm-hmm.
those things. I think, the discussions, the customer conversations, tend to be less structured, less formal. And then we lean really heavily on our UX team, our UX research team, which is really outstanding and kind of goes and really starts as the tip of the spear, I think, for so many of those customer discussion, not just discussions, but usability studies, right? Doing that
Mm-hmm.
both quantitatively and qualitatively, and then letting kind of PMs be alongside, right? Where I think a PM has a hypothesis and works side by side with UX research to then kind of validate or invalidate that through those type of research studies.
And one last question about this topic is someone was once saying to me, "Hey, I want to do more of that at my company, but in terms of interacting more with customers as a PM, but my sales team or my customer success team is very protective of the customer's time, and they don't want PMs kind of asking all these random questions and distracting the customer from what they're trying to sell them on or whatever." How do you think about that?
There's definitely the gatekeeper problem definitely exists, right?
Uh-huh.
Folks really hold their customer relationships very close to their heart. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really about building trust, right? I think the second that you come in and you help pitch on a deal and you close a deal for, an account manager or sales rep, suddenly they want you there all the time, right? And I think when you go the extra mile and show your commitment to customer service, to customer satisfaction, right, as a PM, where you're the one who kind of goes and troubleshoots something, and you show that to a success team member, and they've seen you roll up your sleeves and dig in and
Mm,
solve those really hard problems. I think there can be a tendency to PM like, well, I'm that's I don't have to worry about that, right? There's teams that worry about that, but I think you show that willingness that really builds trust with those folks that are in the trenches with customers every day. And when you can show that you can provide value for the customer, or for a rep, you'll be able to move deals along, you earn that trust, right? And then they want you having those discussions because they know that's what is ultimately going to lead you building better products.
makes a ton of sense. Brewster, the time flew by. Before we wrap up, are there any other things that you wanted to share with the audience or chat about before we wrap up? It's been a great convo.
Oh, thank you for having me. I mean, I would just say to kind of all of the would-be PMs out there is
Mm-hmm.
that, as much as I joke about it's not as glamorous as it seems, is, I think there's nothing more rewarding, at least in a technology environment, than working in product, and that you really do get to the heart of your customers and what matters to them and being able to solve their problems and really generate value. I think I came into this space, into this function, because I felt in finance I was doing more kind of redistributing value than creating it. And so I think the opportunity to solve problems and create value is just the most rewarding thing you can do. So if you're out there thinking about, should I get into this? A wholehearted yes.
Amen. Yeah, it's one of the funnest job functions I can think of, and totally agree. It's a unique opportunity and worth working hard for. Um, Thank you so much for coming on the show, Brewster.
Thank you for
And
having me.
yeah, and for anyone who's watching this, if you made it this far into the interview, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. There's plenty of other future PM leaders coming onto the podcast, and we'll be digging in to get more advice like we've gotten today from Brewster. But appreciate it, Brewster, and hopefully we'll get you back on soon. And congrats on all the amazing traction and success you've had.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Tom.
Take care. Okay.